I walked into that courtroom knowing exactly what would happen. I knew they would look at me and see a child. I knew they would assume I was lost, confused, or in trouble. I knew they would never, not in a million years, guess that I was the one who was going to tear their case apart. And I was right. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the judgment before anyone even spoke? Have you ever seen people's eyes scan you from head to toe, making calculations about who you are and what you're worth based on nothing but how you look? Have you ever been dismissed, underestimated, written off before you even had a chance to open your mouth? I have, my whole life. But I've learned something that most people don't understand. Being underestimated is a weapon, if you know how to use it. My name is Zara Mitchell. I'm 24 years old, but I look about 17. I'm 5'2", 110 pounds, with a baby face that makes convenience store clerks ask for my ID when I buy cough syrup. I wear my natural hair in whatever style is comfortable. I don't wear heels because I don't like them. I don't cake on makeup because I don't need to. And I don't dress to impress anyone because I've never cared about impressing people who judge me before they know me. I graduated from Yale Law School at 22, passed the bar on my first attempt. I've been a practicing attorney for 2 years, specializing in civil rights and criminal defense. I've won cases against prosecutors twice my age with 3 times my experience. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you this because on that Tuesday morning in October, when I walked into courtroom 4B of the Fulton County Superior Court, not a single person in that room knew any of it. They just saw a young black girl in simple clothes, and they made their assumptions. The courtroom was exactly what you'd expect. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly sick, the American flag hanging limply in the corner, and that particular smell that all courtrooms have: old paper, floor polish, and desperation. I was early. I always am. I sat in the gallery near the back, watching the proceedings before my case was called. A parade of defendants shuffled through. Bail hearings, minor charges, people whose lives were being decided in 5-minute increments by a system that didn't care about them. And presiding over it all was Judge Harold Pemberton, 63 years old, silver hair combed back from a face that looked like it had been carved from cold marble, wire-rimmed glasses that he used as a prop, peering over them to make people feel small. He'd been on the bench for over 20 years, and he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never been seriously challenged. I knew his reputation before I walked in. Tough on crime, they called him. But I'd done my research, and I knew what that really meant. In his courtroom, if you were poor, you were probably guilty. If you were black or brown, you were definitely suspicious. He handed out harsh sentences to first-time offenders while giving slaps on the wrist to defendants with expensive lawyers and the right connections. He wasn't a judge. He was a gatekeeper, protecting a system that worked very well for people who looked like him and very badly for people who looked like me. Today, I was going to find out exactly how deep that bias ran. The bailiff called the case Williams v. State of Georgia. My heart started beating faster, but I didn't let it show. I stood up and walked toward the front of the courtroom, keeping my movements calm, deliberate. I could feel eyes on me, curious, dismissive. A few people in the gallery whispered to each other. The prosecutor, a slick-looking white man named Bradley Thornton, mid-40s, expensive suit, the kind of smile that made you want to count your fingers after shaking his hand, glanced up from his files, saw me, and looked immediately past me toward the door, like he was waiting for the real attorney to walk in. And Judge Pemberton? He looked at me like a stray dog that had wandered into his courtroom by mistake. "Young lady," his voice cut through the room, sharp and condescending, "the defendant's table is over there." He pointed with his pen toward the table where my grandmother sat, Evelyn Williams, 72 years old, wearing her best church dress, her hands clasped in her lap, looking more fragile than I had ever seen her. She was the woman who raised me, the woman who worked her fingers to the bone cleaning other people's houses so I could have a chance at something better. And she was sitting there, accused of being a thief because the rich family she had worked for needed someone to blame for their own son's crimes. "And where is your attorney?" Judge Pemberton continued, his voice dripping with impatience. "Did the public defender's office send anyone, or are we wasting the court's time today?" A few snickers rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor's smirk deepened. I could see the calculation in his eyes. Easy case, incompetent opposition, quick win. He had no idea. I walked past the gallery, past the bar, past the whispers and the assumptions. I didn't go to the defendant's table. I went to the attorney's table, pulled out the chair, sat down, opened my briefcase. Judge Pemberton's eyebrows rose toward his hairline. "Excuse me, young lady, I think you're confused. That's the attorney's table. If you're a family member or a friend of the defendant, you need to sit in the—" "Your Honor?" I looked up at him, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm not confused. I'm Zara Mitchell. I'm the attorney of record for Mrs. Evelyn Williams." Silence. Complete, absolute silence. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on everyone in the room. Judge Pemberton stared at me. His mouth actually fell a little open. Bradley Thornton's pen stopped moving on his notepad. My grandmother's eyes filled with tears, but also with something else. Pride. "You?" Judge Pemberton finally managed. "You're the attorney?" "Yes, Your Honor." "How old are you? 15? He laughed. Actually laughed, like I had told him a joke. "Did you pass the bar or the 8th grade?" The courtroom erupted in laughter. The prosecutor chuckled and shook his head. The bailiff smirked. Even some of the people in the gallery joined in, like this was all some hilarious misunderstanding that would be cleared up any moment. I sat perfectly still. Let them laugh. Let them think they were clever. Let them underestimate me. I had been waiting for this moment my entire life. When the laughter died down, I spoke. Calmly, clearly, without a trace of anger in my voice, though believe me, the anger was there, coiled in my chest like a spring. "I'm 24 years old, Your Honor. I graduated from Yale Law School at 22, summa cum laude. I passed the Georgia bar exam on my first attempt with one of the highest scores that year. I've been a practicing attorney for 2 years, and in that time, I've never lost a case." I paused, letting each word land, which is more than I can say for several attorneys who regularly appear in this courtroom. The laughter stopped. Bradley Thornton's smirk vanished. Judge Pemberton's face went from amused to red to something approaching purple. "Watch your tone, young lady." His voice was low now. Dangerous. "I don't know where you think you are, but in my courtroom, I demand respect." I looked at him. Really looked at him. At this man who had probably never been challenged by anyone who looked like me, who had spent decades handing down judgments from on high, never questioning his own assumptions, never examining his own biases. "Respect is earned, Your Honor," I said quietly. "Perhaps we can both demonstrate that today." For a long moment, he just stared at me. I could see him recalculating, trying to figure out who I really was and how to handle me. He had expected a pushover. He had expected someone he could bully into submission. He had expected another easy win for the system that had served him so well. He was about to learn that he had made a serious mistake. "Very well, Ms. Mitchell," he said my name like it tasted bad. "Since you're apparently the attorney of record, let's proceed. But I warn you, I will not tolerate any more disrespect in my courtroom." "I wouldn't dream of it, Your Honor." I opened my file and began reviewing my notes, even though I had them memorized. "I'm just here to ensure my client receives a fair trial. That's all any of us want, isn't it?" He didn't answer. He just glared at me, then shuffled the papers in front of him and called for the prosecution to present their case. Bradley Thornton stood up, buttoning his expensive jacket, still looking at me with a mixture of confusion and condescension. He thought I had gotten lucky with my little speech. He thought I was all talk and no substance. He thought this was going to be easy. What none of them knew, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not the smug, wealthy family sitting in the gallery waiting for my grandmother to be convicted, was that I had spent months preparing for this day. I had evidence they didn't know about. I had witnesses they hadn't anticipated. I had a strategy designed to expose not just the truth about the so-called theft, but the corruption, the bias, and the assumptions that had brought us all to this moment. They looked at me and seen a confused teenager who didn't belong. They looked at my grandmother and seen a poor black housekeeper who must be guilty because that's what housekeepers do, isn't it? They looked at the wealthy white family and seen upstanding citizens who couldn't possibly be lying. They were wrong about all of it. And by the end of this day, I was going to make sure everyone in that courtroom knew it.
To understand why I was in that courtroom, why I became who I am, why I fight the way I fight, you need to know where I came from. You need to know about the little girl who used to sit at the kitchen table in a tiny apartment in Atlanta reading law books while other kids were playing outside. You need to know about the woman who raised her and why saving that woman became the most important thing I would ever do. I don't remember much about my mother. She died when I was 7. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late because she didn't have health insurance and kept putting off the doctor's visits she couldn't afford. What I remember are fragments. The smell of her perfume, something floral and warm. The sound of her laugh, which came easily and often. The way she used to read to me at night, doing different voices for all the characters, making me believe that stories could take you anywhere, even out of a cramped apartment in a neighborhood where gunshots were more common than birdsong. When she died, my world collapsed. My father tried to hold things together, but he was drowning in grief and in debts my mother's illness had created. He started making bad choices, desperate choices. Within 3 years, he was arrested for possession with intent to distribute. He swore he was just holding the drugs for someone else, that he wasn't a dealer, that he had gotten caught up in something he couldn't get out of. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. It didn't matter to the system. They saw a black man from the wrong neighborhood with drugs in his possession, and they threw the book at him. 15 years. I was 10 years old when they took my father away. I remember sitting in that courtroom, not so different from the one I stood in today, watching a judge who looked bored decide my father's fate in less than an hour. I remember the public defender, a tired-looking man with a stained tie, barely putting up a fight. I remember my father looking back at me as they led him away in handcuffs, his eyes full of a pain I was too young to fully understand. That was the day I decided I would become a lawyer. I didn't know what that meant, not really. I just knew that someone should have fought for my father. Someone should have stood up and demanded that the system see him as a person, not just another case number. Someone should have given him a chance. No one did, so I decided I would become that someone, for other people like him, for other families like mine. My grandmother took me in. Evelyn Williams, my mother's mother, the strongest woman I have ever known. She was already in her 50s when I came to live with her, already tired from decades of physical labor, already dealing with arthritis in her hands and pain in her back that she never complained about. But she took me in without a moment's hesitation, because that's who she was. That's who she is. Grandma had been a housekeeper her entire adult life. She cleaned houses for wealthy families across Atlanta, the kind of people who lived in mansions with more bathrooms than our entire apartment had rooms. She scrubbed their toilets, washed their dishes, changed their sheets, raised their children while they were at work or on vacation, or too busy being important to notice the woman who kept their lives running. They didn't see her as a person, they saw her as a function, and that's exactly how the Whitmans saw her too. The Whitmans were the family my grandmother had worked for the longest, 15 years. She started when their oldest child was in elementary school and stayed through college graduations, weddings, grandchildren. Mrs. Whitman used to call her part of the family, which was what wealthy people said when they wanted to feel good about underpaying the help. Part of the family didn't mean she was invited to holiday dinners. Part of the family didn't mean she got health insurance or paid time off. Part of the family meant they expected loyalty without offering respect in return. My grandmother gave them that loyalty anyway. That's who she was. She took pride in her work, even when it wasn't appreciated. She cared for their home like it was her own, even though she would never be able to afford anything like it. She watched their children grow up, celebrated their successes, mourned their struggles. She did everything right for 15 years. And then, one day, she was accused of stealing a $50,000 diamond necklace. When I first heard about the charges, I didn't believe them. I literally laughed because the idea of my grandmother stealing anything was so absurd it seemed like a joke. This was a woman who once found a $20 bill on the street and spent an hour trying to figure out who might have dropped it. A woman who brought back extra change when a cashier made a mistake in her favor. A woman who taught me from the time I was a little girl that your integrity was the only thing no one could take from you.
My grandmother didn't steal that necklace. I knew it in my bones. But when I started digging into the case, I realized that the truth didn't matter to the people prosecuting her. What mattered was that she was a convenient target, a poor black housekeeper with no resources to fight back, easy to accuse, easy to convict, easy to forget. The police investigation was a joke. They took the Whitmans' word for everything, didn't question inconsistencies in the timeline, didn't investigate whether anyone else might have had access to the necklace, didn't consider that maybe, just maybe, the wealthy white family might not be telling the whole truth. They arrested my grandmother on a Tuesday morning. She called me from the police station, her voice shaking, more afraid than I had ever heard her. "Zara, they're saying I stole from the Whitmans. They put me in handcuffs, like I was a criminal." I drove to the station so fast I'm lucky I didn't get pulled over. I posted her bail, which I could barely afford, and took her home. She cried the whole way. Not loud, dramatic sobs, just quiet tears running down her cheeks, like something inside her was slowly breaking. "I never took anything," she kept saying. "In 15 years, I never took so much as a paperclip. Why would they say this about me? Why would they do this?" I didn't have an answer. Not then, but I was going to find one. I took the case myself. Some of the partners at my firm thought I was crazy. "You're too close to this," they said. "You'll be too emotional. Let someone else handle it." But I couldn't. This wasn't just any case. This was my grandmother, the woman who had given up her retirement years to raise me, the woman who had worked her body into exhaustion so I could have books and school supplies and eventually a Yale education, the woman who had never asked for anything in return except that I become someone who made a difference. I wasn't going to let a stranger defend her. I wasn't going to trust the same system that had failed my father to protect her. I was going to fight for her myself with everything I had. So I started investigating. The Whitmans had closed ranks, they weren't talking to me, and they had instructed their staff not to talk to me either. The prosecutor, Bradley Thornton, had made it clear through pre-trial motions that he expected a quick guilty verdict and wasn't interested in entertaining alternative theories. But I kept digging. I pulled financial records. I talked to neighbors, former employees, anyone who might know something about the Whitman family. I spent nights combing through public records, looking for patterns, looking for weaknesses, looking for the truth. And then I found it. Preston Whitman III, the family's 28-year-old golden child, Princeton graduate, supposed to take over the family business someday. But behind the polished exterior, Preston had a problem, a serious problem. He was a gambler. Not the fun kind who goes to Vegas once a year and loses a few $100s. The destructive kind, who bets on everything, chases losses, borrows money from increasingly dangerous people, and destroys his life one wager at a time. I found evidence of massive debts, tens of thousands of dollars owed to underground bookmakers, the kind of people who break kneecaps when they don't get paid. I found evidence that Preston had been selling things to cover his debts: watches, electronics, art from his own family's collection, things that wouldn't immediately be missed. And then I found the pawn shop, a little place on the outskirts of Atlanta, the kind of shop where people brought items and asked no questions. The owner, a man named Earl Simmons, had been in the business for 30 years. He kept meticulous records, partly for his own protection, partly because he was just that kind of guy. When I showed him a photo of Preston Whitman, his eyes widened. "Yeah, I know him. He's been coming in for about a year. Brings in expensive stuff. I always figured he was selling his own things, you know? None of my business why." "What about this?" I showed him a photo of the diamond necklace, the same one my grandmother was accused of stealing. Earl's face went pale. "That's it," he said. "That's the necklace he brought in about 3 days before I saw the news. I still have the receipt. I still have the security footage." I didn't connect it at first because the news said a housekeeper stole it, and this was obviously the family's son. 3 days before, Preston pawned the necklace 3 days before the Whitmans reported it stolen and blamed my grandmother. They knew. They had to know. There was no way they didn't realize their own son had taken the necklace and sold it. But instead of exposing his addiction, instead of dealing with their family's dirty laundry, they had chosen to destroy an innocent woman's life. They had chosen to throw my grandmother under the bus to protect their precious reputation. When I got the security footage from Earl, when I saw Preston Whitman's face clear as day as he handed over the necklace for cash, I sat in my car and cried. Not from sadness, from rage. These people worked my grandmother to the bone for 15 years. They underpaid her, undervalued her, treated her as invisible. And when they needed a scapegoat for their son's crimes, she was the obvious choice. Because who would believe a poor black housekeeper over a wealthy white family? Who would even bother to look for another explanation? They were about to find out exactly who would believe. I was going into that courtroom with everything I had. And I wasn't just going to win my grandmother's freedom, I was going to expose the Whitmans for who they really were. I was going to make Judge Pemberton face his own assumptions. I was going to show everyone in that courtroom that the truth doesn't care what you look like, where you come from, or how much money you have. My grandmother had spent her whole life being invisible. Today, I was going to make sure everyone saw her and saw me.
Let me tell you about the battlefield I walked into that morning, because that's what it was, a battlefield. And I was outnumbered, outgunned, and facing enemies on every side. Start with the judge. Judge Harold Pemberton had been on the bench for 23 years, and in that time, he had built a reputation that depended entirely on who you asked. If you asked the wealthy lawyers who golfed with him at the country club, he was tough but fair, a law and order judge who didn't suffer fools gladly. If you asked the public defenders who stood before him every day, desperately trying to get justice for clients who couldn't afford real representation, he was something else entirely. I had done my research on Pemberton before I ever set foot in his courtroom. I had pulled his sentencing records, analyzed his rulings, spoken quietly to attorneys who had faced him before. The pattern was unmistakable. White defendants with private attorneys received lighter sentences, more lenient bail terms, more benefit of the doubt. Black and brown defendants, especially those with public defenders, received the opposite. First-time offenders who should have gotten probation were sent to prison. Cases that should have been dismissed were allowed to proceed. Objections from certain attorneys were sustained. Objections from others were overruled so consistently it couldn't be coincidence. None of this was ever blatant enough to trigger a formal complaint,
Pemberton was too smart for that. He never said anything explicitly racist. He never made his bias obvious in ways that could be documented and used against him. He just tilted the scales, day after day, case after case, and the system protected him because the system was built by people who thought the same way he did. I knew all of this walking in. I knew that the moment he saw me, he would make assumptions. Young, black, female. In his mind, I was already 3 strikes before I opened my mouth, and when I told him I was the attorney, that was strike 4. People like Pemberton couldn't handle being surprised by people like me. It disrupted their worldview. It made them uncomfortable, and uncomfortable men with power tend to lash out. So I wasn't surprised when he mocked me. I wasn't surprised when he laughed. I wasn't even surprised when he continued to treat me with barely concealed contempt as the proceedings began. I had expected all of it. What I needed to do was use it against him. Then there was the prosecutor, Bradley Thornton, 45 years old, Princeton undergraduate, Harvard Law, partner track at one of Atlanta's most prestigious firms before deciding that being a prosecutor would look better on his future political resume. Everything about Bradley screamed privilege. The $300 haircut, the suit that cost more than my monthly rent, the Rolex that glinted whenever he gestured toward the jury, the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life. Bradley came from money. Old Georgia money, the kind that traced back to plantations and pretended that history didn't matter anymore. His family knew the Whitmans socially. They ran in the same circles, attended the same charity galas, sent their children to the same prep schools. When the Whitmans needed someone to prosecute their housekeeper, Bradley had volunteered for the case personally. He had probably seen it as a favor for friends, an easy win that would require minimal effort, a chance to put another conviction on his record before his inevitable run for district attorney or state legislature or whatever office his family had picked out for him. He hadn't prepared for a real fight. I could tell from the way he shuffled his papers, the casual glances at his notes, the relaxed posture of a man who expected to coast to victory. He thought I was a joke. He thought my grandmother was already convicted. He was wrong. And then there were the Whitmans themselves, sitting in the gallery like royalty, gracing the common people with their presence. Richard Whitman III. They loved their numbers in that family, was 62 years old, CEO of a regional bank connected to half the power players in Atlanta. Silver hair swept back from a face that probably looked distinguished in magazine profiles, but looked smug and entitled in person. He wore a navy suit that probably cost $5,000, and he sat with his legs crossed and his arm draped over the back of the bench like he owned the courtroom, which, in a way, he probably did. Men like Richard Whitman donated to judicial campaigns. They attended fundraisers for prosecutors. They golfed with police commissioners and dined with mayors. The entire system was designed to serve people like him, and he knew it. He had probably never faced a consequence in his life. His wife, Catherine Whitman, sat beside him. 58 years old, former beauty queen, currently serving on 3 different charities that let her feel good about herself while doing almost nothing to actually help anyone. She was dressed in a tasteful cream-colored suit, pearls around her neck, her face carefully arranged in an expression of wounded dignity. Poor Catherine, betrayed by the help, victimized by the woman she had trusted in her home. She probably rehearsed that expression in the mirror. And in the row behind them, trying to look invisible, was Preston. Preston Whitman III. 28 years old, the reason we were all here. He was handsome in that bland, forgettable way that wealthy young men are often, the product of good nutrition and expensive orthodontia, and a life free of real stress. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit right, probably because he'd sold his good ones to pay off his debts. His leg bounced nervously, and he kept checking his phone, and he wouldn't look at my grandmother.
Because he knew. He knew that she was sitting at the defendant's table facing felony charges because of what he had done. He knew that an innocent woman might go to prison so that his family could keep their secrets. And he was too much of a coward to say anything. I watched him during the pretrial motions, trying to read his face. There was guilt there. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, the way he flinched slightly whenever my grandmother's name was mentioned. But there was also weakness. He had been enabled his whole life, protected from the consequences of his choices, told that rules were for other people. He didn't know how to stand up, even when standing up was the right thing to do. The jury was a different kind of obstacle. 12 people selected through a process that was supposed to be fair, but never really was. I had done my best during voir dire, but Bradley had struck most of the black potential jurors for reasons that were technically legal, but transparently racial. What I was left with was a jury that was mostly white, mostly middle-aged, mostly from comfortable suburban neighborhoods. Good people, probably, but people who had never been accused of something they didn't do. People who had never watched the system stack the deck against someone they loved. People who looked at the Whitmans and saw respectable citizens and looked at my grandmother and saw... what? A housekeeper? An employee? Someone who served. People like the Whitmans, not people like themselves. I needed to change how they saw her. I needed to make them see the woman I knew, the grandmother who had sacrificed everything to raise me, who had worked her body to exhaustion for 60 years, who had never taken anything that wasn't hers and never would. But first, I had to get past Judge Pemberton, who was already making it clear that this was going to be an uphill battle. From the moment the trial began, he was against me. He overruled my objections almost automatically, often before I finished speaking. He sustained Bradley's objections even when they were clearly baseless. He allowed leading questions from the prosecution while cutting me off for asking questions that were perfectly proper. Every ruling tilted the playing field a little more in Bradley's favor. Every comment from the bench was designed to undermine my credibility with the jury. He called me young lady instead of counselor. He asked me twice if I was sure about my legal arguments, implying that I didn't know what I was doing. He sighed audibly when I approached the bench, as if my very presence was exhausting him. The message was clear. This child doesn't belong here. Don't take her seriously. And the jury was absorbing that message, whether they realized it or not. When a judge treats an attorney with contempt, juries notice. They follow the authority in the room, and Pemberton was making sure everyone knew who had the authority and who didn't. My grandmother sat at the defendant's table through all of this, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight despite the pain I knew she was feeling. She was wearing her best church dress, a modest blue dress with white buttons that she had bought for my law school graduation. It was the nicest thing she owned. She had her hair done for the occasion, and she wore the small gold cross necklace that had belonged to her mother. She looked dignified. She looked innocent. She looked like exactly what she was, a 72-year-old grandmother who had worked hard her whole life and done nothing wrong. But I could see the fear in her eyes every time Judge Pemberton made a dismissive comment, every time Bradley Thornton implied she was a thief, every time the Whitmans whispered to each other and looked at her like she was something dirty. She had never been in trouble in her life. She had never even gotten a parking ticket, and now she was sitting in a courtroom facing years in prison because wealthy people had decided she was a convenient scapegoat. I reached over and squeezed her hand under the table. "It's going to be okay, Grandma," I whispered. "Trust me." She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much hardship and too little justice. "I trust you, baby. I always have." That trust was everything. That trust was why I couldn't lose. The prosecution's case was exactly what I expected. All surface, no substance. Bradley Thornton called the Whitmans to testify, and they performed beautifully. Catherine Whitman described with practiced tearfulness how she had discovered the necklace missing from her jewelry box, how she had immediately suspected the housekeeper, because who else could it have been? How devastated she was to be betrayed by someone she had welcomed into her home for 15 years. Richard Whitman corroborated everything, adding his own touches, how generous they had been to my grandmother, how they treated her like family, how shocked and hurt they were by her betrayal. Judge Pemberton was sympathetic throughout, asking gentle follow-up questions, practically coaching them through their testimony. When I tried to object to their characterizations, calling my grandmother a thief when that was for the jury to decide, Pemberton overruled me with a wave of his hand.
They presented their evidence, the missing necklace, the timeline that supposedly proved my grandmother had opportunity, the character witnesses who testified that the Whitmans were upstanding citizens who would never make a false accusation. It was thin, so thin that any competent investigation would have seen through it immediately. But no one had conducted a competent investigation. No one had bothered to look beyond the obvious explanation, because the obvious explanation was convenient. Poor housekeeper steals from rich people. Open and shut. Move on to the next case. By the time the prosecution rested, Bradley Thornton looked smug, Judge Pemberton looked satisfied, the jury looked convinced, the Whitmans looked triumphant, and I looked like exactly what they expected, a young, inexperienced attorney who was in her head. Perfect. Let them think that. Let them believe they had already won, because they had no idea what was coming.
The prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars: opportunity, motive, and character assassination, and Bradley Thornton leaned on each one like they were gospel truth. Opportunity was the easiest for him. My grandmother had access to the Whitman home. She had been in the house the day the necklace supposedly went missing. She knew where the jewelry box was, knew the family schedule, knew when the house would be empty. Of course she did. She had worked there for 15 years. She knew that house better than the Whitmans did. But Bradley twisted that knowledge into guilt. The defendant had unrestricted access to the master bedroom, he told the jury, his voice dripping with implication. She knew exactly when Mrs. Whitman would be out. She knew where the valuables were kept. She had 15 years to learn the family's patterns, their vulnerabilities, their blind spots. He made it sound sinister, like my grandmother had been plotting for over a decade, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, like her years of faithful service were actually years of careful reconnaissance. The motive was even more insulting. Bradley painted a picture of a poor, desperate woman who had finally given in to temptation. The defendant earns $12 an hour, he said. She lives in a small apartment in a rough neighborhood. She has no savings, no retirement fund, no safety net, and every day she walked into a home filled with wealth she could never dream of having. He paused for effect, looking at the jury with practiced sincerity. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think Evelyn Williams is a bad person. I think she's a desperate person. I think she saw that necklace, worth $50,000, more than 3 years of her salary, and she made a terrible choice. He was good. I'll give him that. He wasn't painting my grandmother as a career criminal. He was painting her as a sympathetic figure who had simply cracked under the weight of poverty, a victim of circumstance who had done something wrong and needed to face the consequences. It was complete garbage. But the character assassination was the worst part. Bradley called witness after witness to testify about what a wonderful family the Whitmans were. Their pastor talked about their charitable donations. Their neighbors talked about their community involvement. A former employee, carefully coached, I was certain, talked about how generous and kind Mrs. Whitman had always been. Each witness was building the same message. The Whitmans are good people. Good people don't lie. Good people don't falsely accuse innocent women. If they say the housekeeper stole from them, it must be true. By contrast, no one was called to testify about my grandmother's character, not in the prosecution's case anyway, because to Bradley Thornton, my grandmother didn't have character. She was just a housekeeper, just a function, just a poor black woman who had finally done what poor black women were expected to do, commit a crime. When Bradley finished presenting his case, he turned to me with a smile that was almost pitying. "Your witness, counselor." I had cross-examined each of his witnesses carefully, but I hadn't played my full hand. I had poked holes where I could, pointing out that no one had actually seen my grandmother take anything, that the investigation had been remarkably brief, that the timeline had some inconsistencies, but I hadn't revealed what I really knew. Not yet, because I needed the prosecution to feel confident. I needed Bradley to think he had this wrapped up. I needed Judge Pemberton to be so sure of the outcome that he wouldn't see what was coming until it was too late.
So I let them have their moment. I let the jury hear their story without fully countering it. I let everyone in that courtroom believe that I was struggling, that my case was weak, that my grandmother was probably going to be convicted. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, because every time I looked at my grandmother's face, I saw the fear. I saw the doubt. I saw a 72-year-old woman who had worked her entire life, who had never asked for anything she hadn't earned, starting to believe that the system was going to crush her anyway. During a recess, she grabbed my hand. "Baby," she whispered, "if this doesn't go well, I need you to know that I'm proud of you. No matter what happens, you did your best." I had to blink back tears. "Grandma, this is going to go well. I promise you. I have something they don't know about." "What is it?" I squeezed her hand. "Trust me, just a little longer. Can you do that?" She looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the woman who had raised me, the woman who had believed in me when no one else did, the woman who had scraped together every penny so I could have books and tutors and eventually a scholarship to Yale. She had never stopped believing in me. She wasn't going to start now. "I trust you," she said. "I always have." When court resumed, Judge Pemberton looked almost bored. He probably thought this was going to be quick. Prosecution presents its case, defense makes a weak argument, jury convicts, everyone goes home. Standard procedure. "Miss Mitchell," he said, not even trying to hide his condescension, "are you ready to present your defense, or do you need a recess to compose yourself?" I caught the implication. He thought I was overwhelmed, thought I was in over my head, thought I was about to crumble. "No recess needed, Your Honor," I said calmly. "The defense is ready to proceed." Bradley Thornton leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, still wearing that smug smile. The Whitmans whispered to each other in the gallery, probably discussing their dinner plans for after the conviction. Even the jury looked like they had already made their minds. Good. Let them think it's over. The defense calls Earl Simmons to the stand. The name rippled through the courtroom. Bradley's smile flickered. He reached for his witness list, scanning it quickly. Earl Simmons wasn't on there. He couldn't be, because I had only discovered him recently, and I had filed a last-minute motion to add him as a witness. "Objection, Your Honor." Bradley was on his feet. "This witness wasn't on the original discovery list. The prosecution hadn't had adequate time to—" "Your Honor," I interrupted, "I filed a motion 3 days ago explaining the circumstances of this witness's discovery. The evidence Mr. Simmons will present is directly relevant to this case and potentially exculpatory for my client. The rules require that I be allowed to present exculpatory evidence." Pemberton hesitated. This is where his bias would be most obvious. If he excluded a witness who could prove my grandmother's innocence, it would be grounds for appeal.
It would be documented. It would be exactly the kind of thing that could finally come back to haunt him. He didn't like me. He didn't want me to win, but he also didn't want to hand me a reversible error on a silver platter. "I'll allow it," he said grudgingly, "but I'm going to keep a tight leash on this testimony. Any fishing expeditions and I'll shut it down." "Understood, Your Honor." Earl Simmons walked into the courtroom looking uncomfortable in his one good suit, a brown thing that was probably 20 years old, slightly too big in the shoulders. He was 63 years old, gray-bearded, with the weathered look of a man who had worked hard his whole life. He ran a pawn shop on the edge of the city, the kind of place that survived on other people's desperation. But he was honest, he kept records, and he was about to blow this case wide open. I walked him through the basics first. Name, occupation, how long he'd been in business. The jury needed to see him as credible before I got to the important stuff. "Mr. Simmons," I said, "in the course of your business, do you keep records of the items you purchase?" "Yes, ma'am. Everything. Photos, descriptions, serial numbers when applicable, and the identification of the seller. It's partly for legal compliance, partly for my own protection." "And do you have security cameras in your shop?" "I do. They run 24/7. I keep the footage for at least a year before it gets recorded over."
I picked up a photograph from my table and approached the witness stand. Mr. Simmons, I'm showing you what has been marked as Defense Exhibit A. Do you recognize the item in this photograph? He looked at it and nodded. Yes, ma'am. That's a diamond necklace. I purchased it approximately 6 months ago. A murmur went through the courtroom. Bradley Thornton sat up straighter. The Whitmans' whispering stopped abruptly. Can you tell the court when, specifically, you purchased this necklace? October 15th of last year. It's in my records. And do your records indicate who sold you this necklace? Yes, ma'am, they do. I paused, letting the silence build. Every eye in the courtroom was on Earl Simmons. Even Judge Pemberton had stopped looking bored. Who sold you this necklace, Mr. Simmons? He cleared his throat. A young man named Preston Whitman. He showed me his driver's license for identification. I have a copy in my files. The courtroom erupted. Bradley Thornton shouted an objection that was swallowed by the noise. Richard Whitman was on his feet, his face purple with rage. Catherine Whitman looked like she was about to faint. And Preston? Preston was trying to stand, trying to leave, but the bailiff was already moving to block his exit. I didn't react. I just stood there, calm and still, watching the chaos unfold. This was the moment I had been waiting for. This was the truth finally clawing its way into the light. Judge Pemberton banged his gavel, again and again trying to restore order. Quiet. Everyone quiet. I will have order in this courtroom. It took nearly a full minute for the noise to die down. When it finally did, Bradley Thornton was on his feet, his face flushed, his earlier composure completely gone. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The prosecution was not informed of this evidence. We need time to... You'll have time for redirect, I said calmly. Right now, I'm still examining my witness. I turned back to Earl Simmons before Pemberton could intervene. Mr. Simmons, you said Preston Whitman sold you this necklace on October 15th. Can you tell the court when the Whitman family reported this necklace stolen? Objection. Bradley was practically shouting. The witness can't testify to... I can answer that, Your Honor. I saw it on the news. October 18th, 3 days after the young man sold it to me. 3 days. Preston Whitman had sold the necklace to a pawn shop 3 full days before his family reported it stolen and blamed my grandmother. The implications were obvious. The Whitmans had to have known. There was no way they didn't realize their own son had taken the necklace before they went to the police. They had lied. They had filed a false report. They had knowingly tried to send an innocent woman to prison to protect their son's secret. And now, finally, everyone in that courtroom knew it too. I looked at the jury. For the first time since the trial began, I saw doubt on their faces. Real doubt. The kind that meant they were actually thinking, actually questioning the story they had been fed. And when I glanced at Judge Pemberton, I saw something I had never expected to see on his face. Fear. The courtroom was still buzzing with whispered conversations as I continued my examination of Earl Simmons. Judge Pemberton had restored order, but the damage was done. The Whitmans' carefully constructed narrative was crumbling, and everyone could see it. Mr. Simmons, I continued, keeping my voice calm and measured, you mentioned that you keep security footage of all transactions in your shop. Do you have footage from October 15th, the day Preston Whitman sold you the necklace? Yes, ma'am, I do. I turned to Judge Pemberton. Your Honor, the defense moves to admit Defense Exhibit B, security footage from Earl's pawn shop dated October 15th of last year. Bradley Thornton was on his feet immediately. Objection! Your Honor, we haven't had time to authenticate this footage or verify its chain of custody. This could be fabricated, edited. The footage has been authenticated by a certified forensic video analyst, I said, producing another document from my file. I have his sworn affidavit here, along with a complete chain of custody log. The defense is prepared to call the analyst as a witness if the prosecution wishes to challenge the authenticity of the evidence.
Pemberton looked at the documents I handed to the clerk. His jaw tightened. He wanted to exclude this evidence, I could see it in his eyes, but I had dotted every I and crossed every T. There was no legitimate reason to keep it out. "Objection overruled," he said through gritted teeth. "The footage may be admitted." I nodded to the bailiff, who had already set up a television and DVD player at my request. The courtroom fell silent as the screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. A pawnshop counter, Earl Simmons behind it, and walking through the door, unmistakably, was Preston Whitman III. The timestamp in the corner read October 15, 2:47 p.m. We watched as Preston approached the counter, pulled something from his jacket pocket, and handed it to Earl. The camera angle caught it perfectly. A diamond necklace glittering under the fluorescent lights. Earl examined it, nodded, and handed Preston a form to sign. Then he counted out cash, stacks of bills that Preston shoved into his pockets with the desperate speed of a man who needed money immediately. The whole transaction took less than 5 minutes. When the footage ended, I let the silence stretch. Let the jury absorb what they had just seen. Let the Whitmans feel the weight of their lies collapsing around them. I turned to look at Preston. He was slumped in his seat in the gallery, his face pale, his hands shaking. His father was gripping his arm, whispering furiously. His mother had her hand pressed to her mouth like she might be sick. "No further questions for this witness, Your Honor," I said, "but the defense has additional evidence to present." Bradley Thornton stood slowly, looking like a man who had just realized he was standing on quicksand. "The prosecution requests a brief recess to review this new evidence." Denied. The word came from Judge Pemberton, and it surprised everyone, including me. He was looking at the Whitmans with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This trial has already been delayed enough. We'll continue. Ms. Mitchell, call your next witness." I nodded. The defense calls Preston Whitman III to the stand. The reaction was immediate. Richard Whitman shot to his feet. "Absolutely not. This is harassment. My son has nothing to do with—" "Mr. Whitman," Judge Pemberton's voice cut through the outburst like a knife. "Sit down. You are not an attorney, and you will not speak in my courtroom unless you are called to testify." Richard Whitman looked like he had been slapped. He probably couldn't remember the last time anyone had spoken to him that way. But even he could see that the tide had turned. He sat down, still gripping Preston's arm. "Preston Whitman," the bailiff called, "please approach the stand to be sworn in." For a long moment, Preston didn't move. He sat frozen in his seat, his eyes darting between his parents, the door, and me. He was calculating, I could tell, wondering if he could somehow get out of this, wondering if there was still a way to escape. There wasn't. "Mr. Whitman," Judge Pemberton said, his voice hard, "you have been called as a witness. You are required to testify. If you refuse, I will hold you in contempt of court. Do I make myself clear?" Slowly, reluctantly, Preston stood. He walked to the witness stand like a man walking to his own execution. The bailiff swore him in, and he sat down, his hands gripping the arms of the chair like he needed something to hold on to. I approached the stand slowly, deliberately. I wanted him to feel every second. I wanted him to understand that the comfortable life he had always known, the consequences he had always escaped, were finally catching up to him. "Mr. Whitman," I began, "you just saw the video footage of yourself selling a diamond necklace to Earl's pawn shop on October 15th. Do you deny that was you in the video?" He swallowed hard. His eyes flicked to his father in the gallery. Richard Whitman gave a tiny shake of his head, but it was too late for signals, too late for coaching. The whole courtroom had seen. I don't deny it," he said quietly. "Speak up, please. The jury needs to hear you." He cleared his throat. "I don't deny it. That was me. And the necklace you sold, was that the same diamond necklace your family later reported as stolen?" I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of necklaces." "Really?" I picked up the photograph of the necklace and held it up.
This is your mother's necklace. Defense Exhibit A. The same necklace you sold to Mr. Simmons. Are you telling this court that you don't recognize it? He looked at the photograph, then looked away. It looks similar. Similar. I let the word hang in the air. Mr. Whitman, your mother testified that this necklace was a family heirloom, passed down from her grandmother. Are you saying there are multiple identical family heirlooms floating around? A few people in the gallery actually laughed. Preston's face reddened. No, I'm saying I don't remember exactly. Let me help you remember. I returned to my table and picked up another document. This is a receipt from Earl's pawn shop, dated October 15th, signed by you. It describes the item sold as, and I quote, one diamond necklace, approximately 42 stones, platinum setting, appraised value $45,000 to $50,000. Does that match the description of your mother's missing necklace? Preston's mouth opened, closed. He looked like a fish gasping for air. Mr. Whitman, I'll ask again. Did you sell your mother's diamond necklace to a pawn shop on October 15th? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, finally, so quietly I almost couldn't hear it. Yes. The word detonated in the courtroom. More gasps, more whispers. Catherine Whitman let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a scream. Richard Whitman was on his feet again, his face contorted with rage, but Judge Pemberton didn't silence him this time. He just stared at Preston, his expression unreadable. Mr. Whitman, why did you sell your mother's necklace? He didn't answer. Was it because of your gambling debts? His head snapped up. How do you... I've done my research, Mr. Whitman. I know about the debts. I know about the bookmakers. I know about the threats. I held up another document. This is a record of wired transfers from your personal bank account over the past 2 years, payments to known gambling operations, cash withdrawals that coincide with major sporting events, a pattern of desperate financial behavior that culminated in you stealing from your own mother to pay off people who were threatening to hurt you. Preston was shaking now, actually shaking. You don't understand, he said, his voice cracking. They were going to... I didn't have a choice. I needed the money. I thought I could win it back. I always thought I could win it back. So you stole the necklace, sold it, and used the money to pay your debts. He nodded miserably. And 3 days later, when your parents discovered the necklace was missing, what happened? He didn't answer. Did you tell them the truth, Mr. Whitman? Silence. Did you confess that you had taken the necklace and sold it? More silence. His eyes were fixed on the floor. Or did you let them blame someone else, someone who couldn't fight back, someone who would be easy to accuse because she was poor and black and had access to the house? Objection! Bradley Thornton was on his feet. Counsel is testifying, not questioning. Sustained, Pemberton said, but his voice was mechanical, distant. He was still staring at Preston. Mr. Whitman, I'll rephrase, I said. Mr. Whitman, did you tell your parents that you had sold the necklace? A long pause. Then, no. Did they discover it themselves? Did they confront you about it? They found out eventually, after they'd already called the police. So your parents reported the necklace stolen before they knew you had taken it. Preston hesitated. His eyes flicked to his parents again. His father's face was purple with rage. His mother was crying. Mr. Whitman, I'll ask again. When did your parents learn that you had sold the necklace, before or after they blamed my grandmother? His voice came out as a whisper. After. How long after? I don't remember exactly. Was it before or after Evelyn Williams was arrested? He closed his eyes, took a shaky breath, and then, in a voice so small I had to strain to hear it, after. The courtroom exploded. This time, Judge Pemberton didn't even try to restore order immediately. He sat back in his chair, his face ashen, watching the chaos unfold. I turned to look at my grandmother. She was crying, not from fear this time, but from relief. She knew. She could see it on the faces of the jury, in the reactions of everyone in the gallery. The truth was finally out. I waited for the noise to die down, then turned back to Preston. Mr. Whitman, one final question.
After your parents learned that you had sold the necklace, after they knew the truth, did they go to the police and withdraw their complaint against my grandmother? He couldn't look at me, couldn't look at anyone. No, he whispered. They knew she was innocent, and they let her be prosecuted anyway. He nodded. They said it would ruin our family if people found out about my problem. They said Evelyn would be fine, that she'd just get probation or something, and nobody would ever have to know. They chose to let an innocent woman go to prison rather than admit that their son was a gambler. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. No further questions, I said, and turned away from the witness stand. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard.
The courtroom was still reeling from Preston's confession when I made my next move. I had broken the case wide open. I had proven my grandmother's innocence, but I wasn't done yet. This was never just about winning a case. This was about making the system face what it had done, making everyone in that courtroom understand how close they had come to destroying an innocent woman's life, and making sure it never happened again. Your Honor, I said, my voice cutting through the lingering whispers, in light of this testimony, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges against Evelyn Williams. Bradley Thornton was on his feet, but he looked defeated. His expensive suit suddenly seemed to hang on him wrong, like he had shrunk inside it. Your Honor, the prosecution needs time to review this new evidence, and what is there to review, Mr. Thornton? I turned to face him directly. Your star witnesses have been exposed as liars. Your case was built on a foundation of racism and classism disguised as justice. An innocent woman was arrested, charged, and nearly convicted because it was easier to believe that a black housekeeper was a thief than to consider that a wealthy white family might be protecting their own. Objection, Bradley sputtered. Counsel is making inflammatory accusations. Am I? I walked toward the jury, holding their attention. Let's review what happened here. A diamond necklace went missing. The police were called, and without any investigation, without any evidence, they arrested the housekeeper. Why? Because she was the obvious suspect? No, because she was the convenient suspect. I gestured toward the Whitmans, still sitting in the gallery. Richard Whitman's face was a mask of cold fury. Catherine was sobbing quietly into a handkerchief. Preston sat with his head in his hands, broken. The Whitmans knew their son had a gambling problem. They knew he had been selling their possessions to pay his debts. They may not have known exactly what happened to the necklace at first, but they found out. And when they did, they made a choice. I let that word hang in the air. They chose to protect their son. They chose to protect their reputation. And they chose to sacrifice an innocent woman to do it. Because in their world, people like my grandmother don't matter. We're not real people to them. We're just the help. I turned back to the bench. And they almost got away with it. Because the system was designed to let them get away with it. Judge Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Miss Mitchell, this is not the time for... Isn't it, Your Honor? I took a step toward the bench, my voice steady, but carrying an edge I didn't bother to hide. Isn't this exactly the time? Because what happened in this courtroom over the past 2 days is a perfect example of how the system fails people like my grandmother. I pulled a document from my file. I have here a record of your rulings in this trial, Your Honor. 17 objections from the prosecution, 16 sustained. 12 objections from the defense, 11 overruled. You allowed leading questions from Mr. Thornton while cutting me off for basic cross-examination. You made comments designed to undermine my credibility with the jury. You called me young lady instead of counselor. You asked me repeatedly if I was sure I knew what I was doing. The courtroom was dead silent now. No one had ever spoken to Judge Pemberton like this. I could see the shock on the faces of the other attorneys in the gallery, the law students who had come to observe. Even the bailiff looked stunned. From the moment I walked into this courtroom, Your Honor, you decided who I was based on how I looked. Young, black, female. You assumed I didn't belong here. You assumed I was incompetent, and because of those assumptions, you gave every advantage to the prosecution and made me fight for every inch of ground. Pemberton's face was turning red. Miss Mitchell, I will not tolerate. What, Your Honor? Disrespect?
I held his gaze without flinching. I've been disrespected from the moment I walked through those doors. My grandmother has been disrespected from the moment she was arrested, and I am tired of being told to accept it quietly. I turned to face the jury. Look at her, I said, gesturing toward my grandmother. Really look at her. Evelyn Williams, 72 years old. She's worked as a housekeeper for over 50 years. She raised 3 children on her own after her husband died. She raised me when my mother passed and my father was sent to prison. She has never stolen anything in her life. She has never been arrested. She has never even gotten a parking ticket. My voice cracked slightly, but I pressed on. She worked for the Whitman family for 15 years. She cleaned their house, did their laundry, took care of their children. She worked through pain because she couldn't afford to take sick days. She missed her own grandchildren's birthdays because the Whitmans needed her at their parties. She gave them everything she had. I paused, feeling the weight of every word. And when they needed someone to blame for their son's crimes, they didn't hesitate to throw her away like garbage, because to them, that's all she ever was. Catherine let out a sob. I didn't look at her. My grandmother almost went to prison today, not because of anything she did, but because of who she is and who she isn't, because she's poor and they're rich, because she's black and they're white, because the system was designed to believe them and doubt her. I turned back to Judge Pemberton. You are part of that system, Your Honor. You sat on that bench and let it happen. You laughed when I told you I was an attorney. You undermined me at every turn.
And if I hadn't found Earl Simmons, if I hadn't discovered the truth, you would have let this jury send an innocent woman to prison. His face was ashen now. The anger had drained away, replaced by something else. Shame, maybe, or fear. He knew what this would look like when it got out. He knew his reputation, carefully maintained for over 2 decades, was about to be shattered. I'm not asking you to apologize, I said quietly. I'm not asking for anything for myself, but I am demanding justice for my grandmother. Dismiss the charges now and refer this matter to the district attorney for investigation of the Whitman family for filing false charges, perjury, and obstruction of justice. Bradley Thornton stood slowly. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the past hour. Your Honor, he said, his voice hollow, the prosecution withdraws its case against Evelyn Williams. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. We acknowledge that new evidence has come to light that raises serious questions about the validity of the charges. The prosecution will conduct a full review and consider whether charges should be filed against other parties. Judge Pemberton sat in silence for a long moment. The entire courtroom waited, barely breathing. Then he spoke, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. The charges against Evelyn Williams are hereby dismissed. The defendant is free to go. He paused, seeming to struggle with the next words. The court also notes the defense's request for a referral to the district attorney regarding the conduct of the Whitman family. The court will take that request under advisement. That's not good enough, I said. Pemberton's head snapped up. Excuse me? I said that's not good enough, Your Honor. Taking under advisement means nothing. It means this gets buried. It means the Whitmans write a check to the right people and this all goes away. It means my grandmother gets released, but the people who tried to destroy her face no consequences. I held up my phone. I've recorded today's proceedings. Everything. Preston's confession, the video evidence, this entire conversation. If this court does not formally refer this matter for investigation, I will release this recording to every news outlet in Georgia. I will file a formal complaint with the Judicial Ethics Board, and I will make sure that everyone knows exactly what happened here today. The threat hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Judge Pemberton's face went through a series of emotions: rage, fear, resignation. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He knew his career was in my hands.
The court, he said stiffly, formally refers this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of Richard Whitman, Catherine Whitman, and Preston Whitman III for potential violations, including filing a false police report, perjury, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Richard Whitman was on his feet again. "This is outrageous. We are the victims here. That woman—" "Mr. Whitman," Pemberton's voice cracked like a whip, "you will be silent. You and your family are now subjects of a criminal investigation. I strongly suggest you retain counsel immediately. Bailiff, please escort the Whitman family from the courtroom." I watched as Richard Whitman was forcibly removed, still protesting, his wife stumbling after him in tears, their son shuffling behind like a broken puppet. The gallery erupted in whispers and shocked conversations. I didn't care about any of it. I only cared about one person. I turned and walked to the defense table where my grandmother was sitting, her hands pressed to her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Grandma," I knelt beside her, taking her hands in mine. "It's over. You're free. They can never hurt you again." She looked at me, her eyes red and swollen, her face wet with tears. But underneath the tears, I saw something I had been afraid I would never see again. Peace. "My baby," she whispered. "My brilliant, beautiful baby. You did it. You really did it." "We did it," I said. "You raised me. You made me who I am. Everything I did today I did because of you." She pulled me into a hug right there in the middle of the courtroom, and I let her hold me the way she used to when I was a little girl afraid of thunderstorms. The noise around us faded. The judge, the gallery, the attorneys, the chaos, none of it mattered. All that mattered was this moment, this woman, this victory. When we finally pulled apart, I helped her to her feet. She was unsteady, overwhelmed, but she was standing. She had been knocked down by the system, by the Whitmans, by everyone who had looked at her and seen only what they expected to see. But she was standing, and so was I. As we walked toward the courtroom doors, I caught Judge Pemberton's eye one last time. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than he had been when I first walked in. The man who had mocked me, laughed at me, tried to make me feel like I didn't belong, that man was gone. In his place was someone who had been forced to confront his own failures. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. My grandmother and I walked out of that courtroom together, heads held high, into a world that would never look at either of us the same way again.
The story didn't end when we walked out of that courtroom. In some ways, it was just beginning. The Whitman case made news that same evening. Local stations ran it first. "Wealthy family accused of framing housekeeper" scrolled across the bottom of screens during the 6 o'clock broadcast. By the next morning, it had gone national. CNN picked it up, MSNBC, even Fox, though they tried to spin it in ways that made my stomach turn. The video I had threatened to release? I didn't need to release it. Someone in the courtroom, a law student I later learned, had been live tweeting the entire trial. Their thread went viral. By the time I woke up the morning after the verdict, my name was trending on Twitter. Hashtags like Justice for Evelyn and Zara Mitchell were everywhere. My phone had so many notifications, it actually crashed twice trying to load them all. I didn't know how to feel about any of it. I hadn't done this for fame or recognition. I had done it for my grandmother. I had done it because an innocent woman was about to be destroyed by a system that saw her as disposable. But if the attention helped shine a light on the problems in that system, I wasn't going to complain. The Whitmans faced consequences almost immediately. Within a week, the district attorney announced that Richard, Catherine, and Preston Whitman had all been charged with filing a false police report, a misdemeanor in Georgia that could carry up to 12 months in jail and a fine of up to $1,000. Catherine and Richard were also charged with perjury. They had lied under oath during the trial, and there was video evidence to prove it. That was a felony. Up to 10 years in prison, though rarely actually sentenced that harshly for first-time offenders. Preston faced additional charges related to the theft of the necklace itself.
Even though he had stolen from his own family, it was still technically larceny, and the value of the necklace pushed it into felony territory. His gambling debts also came under scrutiny. Investigators discovered he had been dealing with some very unsavory people, the kind who didn't appreciate publicity. I heard through the grapevine that he had checked himself into a rehab facility as much for protection as for treatment. Richard Whitman tried to fight, of course. He hired the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in Atlanta. He gave interviews claiming he was the victim of a witch hunt and a rush to judgment. He implied, without quite saying it directly, that I had somehow manufactured the evidence against his family. But it didn't work. The evidence was too clear, the video was too damning, and public opinion had already turned against him. The man who had spent his life being protected by his wealth and connections suddenly found that those protections had limits. His bank's board of directors quietly asked him to step down as CEO. Several of the charities Catherine served on removed her from their boards. Their country club membership was not renewed, a polite way of saying they were no longer welcome. Their oldest friends stopped returning their calls. I didn't feel sorry for them. Maybe that makes me cold, but I had watched them sit in that courtroom, perfectly willing to let my grandmother go to prison for something they knew she didn't do. I had heard Preston admit that they thought she would just get probation, as if a few months in jail was nothing, as if she didn't matter at all. They had treated her as less than human, and now they were learning what it felt like to have the world look at them with contempt. Judge Pemberton faced a different kind of reckoning. I did file a formal complaint with the Judicial Ethics Board, detailing his conduct during the trial. I wasn't the first to file such a complaint. Once the news broke, several other attorneys came forward with their own stories. A public defender who had watched him hand down disproportionate sentences to black defendants for years. A civil rights attorney who had tried to challenge him and been shut down. Law students who had observed his courtroom and been disturbed by what they saw. The ethics board launched an investigation. Pemberton was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. I heard that he retained his own attorney and was fighting the accusations, but the writing was on the wall. Even if he survived the formal process, his reputation was destroyed. No one would ever look at him the same way again. Some people said I went too far, that I should have been satisfied with winning my grandmother's case and left it at that, that challenging a sitting judge so publicly was unprofessional, that it would make other judges reluctant to deal with me, that I was burning bridges. I didn't care. Those bridges were built on injustice. They needed to burn. My grandmother's life changed too, though more quietly.
The Whitmans, as part of their desperate attempt to salvage some public goodwill, agreed to a settlement in the civil lawsuit I filed on her behalf. I can't disclose the exact amount. The agreement included a confidentiality clause, but I can say it was enough. Enough for my grandmother to never have to work again. Enough for her to finally rest. Enough for her to live comfortably for whatever years she had left. She moved out of the small apartment she had lived in for decades. I helped her find a nice townhouse in a quiet neighborhood with a little garden where she could grow tomatoes and flowers. She resisted at first, said it was too much, said she didn't need it, said she had been fine where she was. But I insisted. "Grandma," I told her, "you spent your whole life taking care of other people's homes. Let me give you one of your own." The day she moved in, she walked through every room slowly, running her hands over the walls, the countertops, the fixtures. Everything new, everything hers. When she got to the kitchen, she stopped and looked out the window at the small backyard. "Your mama would have loved this," she said quietly. "She always wanted a house with a garden." I put my arm around her. "She'd be proud of you, Grandma. She is proud of you." She shook her head. "She'd be proud of you, baby girl. You're the one who made this happen. We made it happen together, just like always." She hugged me then, and I felt the weight of everything we had been through finally start to lift. We had survived. We had won. And we were going to be okay. My own life changed too, though I was slower to notice it. The publicity from the case brought attention to my work, and suddenly I was being contacted by news outlets, legal organizations, and potential clients from all over the country. People who had been wrongly accused, people who had been failed by the system, people who had watched my courtroom confrontation go viral and thought, maybe she can help me too. I couldn't help everyone. I was still just one person working at a small civil rights firm with limited resources, but I helped who I could. And I started speaking publicly about the issues the case had exposed, about implicit bias in the justice system, about the way wealth and race influenced outcomes, about the need for systemic reform. I gave interviews, I wrote articles, I spoke at law schools and community centers and wherever else people would listen. Some people called me an activist. I didn't argue with the label, but it wasn't quite right either. I wasn't trying to overthrow the system. I was trying to make it work the way it was supposed to. I was trying to make sure that people like my grandmother, people like my father, people like all the invisible millions who got ground up by the machinery of justice every day, had someone fighting for them. I thought about my father a lot during those months. He was still in prison, still serving the remainder of his sentence. I had visited him after the trial, told him everything that happened. He had cried, the first time I had ever seen him cry. "I'm so proud of you, baby girl," he said through the glass partition. "You beat them." "I beat one case, Daddy. There's so many more to fight." "Then fight them. All of them. Don't stop until the whole damn system changes." I was working on it. I had already started looking into his case, digging through the old files, looking for evidence of the bias and inadequate representation that had landed him in prison for 15 years for a first-time offense. It would be a long fight. Post-conviction relief was notoriously difficult, but I wasn't going to give up. He had given me life. My grandmother had raised me. The least I could do was try to give them both their freedom. About 6 months after the trial, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Catherine Whitman. I almost threw it away without reading it. What could she possibly have to say that I would want to hear? But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. It was short, handwritten. Her penmanship was shaky, like her hands had been trembling as she wrote. "Dear Miss Mitchell, I know you have no reason to read this, and even less reason to believe anything I say, but I need to try to say it anyway. I am sorry. I'm sorry for what we did to your grandmother. I'm sorry for the lies we told and the harm we caused. I'm sorry for treating her as less than human when she was always more than we deserved. I told myself I was protecting my son. I told myself that Evelyn would be fine, that it wouldn't really hurt her. I lied to myself because the truth was too ugly to face. But now I see it. I see what we did. I see who we were, and I am ashamed. This apology doesn't fix anything, I know that. I don't expect forgiveness, I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that I understand now. What we did was wrong, and I am sorry. Catherine Whitman. I read the letter 3 times, then I folded it up, put it in a drawer, and never responded. I didn't tell my grandmother about it. Some wounds don't heal just because someone says they're sorry. Some betrayals can't be forgiven with a handwritten note. But I kept the letter anyway. Maybe as proof that even people who do terrible things sometimes have to face what they've done. Maybe as a reminder that the fight I was fighting actually mattered. Or maybe just because I wasn't quite ready to let go of it yet. Forgiveness is complicated. Justice is complicated. Being a black woman in America is complicated. But one thing was simple. I had walked into that courtroom and refused to be diminished. I had faced a biased judge, a hostile prosecutor, and a wealthy family who thought they could crush anyone who got in their way. And I had won. Not just for my grandmother, for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every little black girl who dreamed of doing something impossible and was told to be realistic. I had proven the impossible was possible, and I was just getting started.
People ask me all the time how I did it.
How I walked into that courtroom knowing the deck was stacked against me. How I stayed calm when a judge laughed in my face. How I found the strength to fight back against people who had more money, more power, and more connections than I could ever dream of. They want a formula, a step-by-step guide to beating the system, a secret weapon they can copy and use in their own battles. But the truth is simpler and harder than any formula. The truth is that I was terrified. Every single moment of that trial, I was terrified. When Judge Pemberton mocked my age, my heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone in the courtroom could hear it. When Bradley Thornton presented his case and the jury nodded along, I felt sick to my stomach. When I called Earl Simmons to the stand and waited for him to confirm what I had discovered, my hands were shaking under the table. I wasn't fearless. I was afraid. But I refused to let my fear make my decisions for me. That's the first thing I want you to understand. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is being afraid and doing it anyway. It's feeling your heart race and your palms sweat and your voice want to tremble and still standing up and speaking your truth. Every brave person you've ever admired was scared. They just didn't let the fear stop them. I learned that from my grandmother. She was afraid too, sitting at that defendant's table, facing years in prison for something she didn't do. She was afraid when the police put her in handcuffs. She was afraid when she called me from the station, her voice breaking. She was afraid every single day of that trial, watching the system that was supposed to protect her tried to destroy her instead. But she never gave up hope. She never stopped believing in me. And when I asked her to trust me, even when things looked darkest, she did. That trust meant everything. It was the foundation I built my entire case on. Because when you know someone believes in you completely, you find strength you didn't know you had. The second thing I want you to understand is this. Being underestimated is not a curse. It's an opportunity. My whole life, people have looked at me and seen what they expected to see. A black girl from a poor neighborhood, a teenager who couldn't possibly be as smart as she claimed, a young woman who didn't belong in certain spaces, certain rooms, certain professions. They made their judgments before I ever opened my mouth. And for a long time, that hurt. It made me angry. It made me want to scream, to prove them wrong, to force them to see me as I really was. But somewhere along the way, I realized something. Their assumptions were not my responsibility. I couldn't control what people thought when they looked at me. I could only control what I did with their expectations. And low expectations, it turned out, were a tactical advantage. When Judge Pemberton saw me walk into his courtroom, he relaxed. He thought this was going to be easy. He thought he was dealing with an amateur, someone he could bulldoze without any real resistance. He dropped his guard because he was so sure I wasn't a threat. That was his mistake. While he was busy feeling superior, I was watching, learning, gathering ammunition. By the time he realized I was a serious opponent, it was too late. I had already built my case. I had already set my traps. And when they snapped shut, he never saw it coming. If he had taken me seriously from the beginning, maybe he would have been more careful. Maybe he would have hidden his bias better. Maybe he would have made it harder for me to expose him. But he didn't take me seriously. And that gave me the space I needed to beat him. So if people underestimate you, let them. Let them think you're not a threat. Let them relax into their assumptions. Let them believe their own stories about who you are and what you're capable of. And then show them exactly how wrong they were. The third thing I want you to understand is harder. It's about anger. I am an angry person. I don't say that as a confession or an apology. I say it as a statement of fact. I am angry at the system that failed my father, angry at the poverty that ground my grandmother down for decades, angry at the racism and sexism and classism that have shaped every moment of my life, angry at every person who has ever looked at me and seen less than I am.
For a long time, I tried to hide that anger. I thought it was unprofessional. I thought it made me look emotional, irrational, difficult. I thought I had to be twice as calm and 3 times as composed as everyone else just to be taken seriously. But I was wrong. Anger is not a weakness. Anger is fuel. Anger is what gets you out of bed at 4 in the morning to prepare for a trial that feels unwinnable. Anger is what keeps you digging through documents when your eyes are burning and your back is aching. Anger is what gives you the strength to stand in front of a hostile judge and tell him exactly what you think of his bias. That was my anger, finally given voice, and it felt like justice. Not revenge, justice. The fourth thing I want you to understand is about winning. When I left that courtroom with my grandmother, people called it a victory, and it was, in a way. We won the case, we exposed the truth, we forced accountability on people who had never faced consequences before. But I want to be honest with you. The system didn't change that day. One judge was investigated, one prosecutor was embarrassed, one wealthy family faced consequences. But there are thousands of judges like Pemberton, thousands of prosecutors like Thornton, thousands of families like the Whitmans using their money and power to crush people who can't fight back. My grandmother is free, but how many other grandmothers are still sitting in prison for crimes they didn't commit? How many other public defenders are too overworked to mount real defenses? How many other juries are making decisions based on bias they don't even recognize? This fight is not over. It will never be over, not in my lifetime. And that used to make me feel hopeless. What was the point of fighting battles you could never fully win? What was the point of pushing against a mountain that would never move? But I've come to see it differently now. You don't fight because you're guaranteed to win. You fight because fighting is what you do. You fight because every small victory matters, even if it doesn't change the whole world. You fight because someone has to, and if not you, then who? My grandmother used to tell me a story about her own grandmother, my great-grandmother, who was born in Alabama in 1920. She lived through Jim Crow, through segregation, through horrors I can barely imagine. She never got to vote until she was nearly 50 years old. She never got to eat in the same restaurants as white people until she was even older. She spent most of her life being told in 1,000 different ways that she was less than human. But she never stopped fighting, never stopped demanding her dignity, never stopped teaching her children that they deserved better, even when the world told them otherwise. She didn't live to see Obama elected. She didn't live to see a lot of things, but she planted seeds that grew into flowers she would never get to see. That's what we do. We plant seeds. We fight battles knowing that the war will go on long after we're gone. We push the mountain 1 inch at a time, trusting that the inches will add up eventually. It's not satisfying. It's not the kind of victory that gets celebrated in movies, but it's real, and it's important, and it's what I'm going to keep doing for the rest of my life. The last thing I want to tell you is the most important. It's what I say to every young person who asks me for advice, every black girl who writes to me wondering if she can really make it in a world that seems determined to hold her back. You belong. Wherever you want to be, whatever you want to do, whoever you want to become, you belong. Not because the world will make room for you. The world won't. You'll have to make room for yourself, with your elbows out and your head high and your voice loud enough to be heard over everyone trying to drown you out. But you belong anyway. Your dreams are valid. Your anger is valid. Your ambition is valid. Don't let anyone tell you to be smaller, quieter, more realistic. Don't let anyone convince you that the spaces you want to occupy weren't meant for people who look like you. They want you to believe you don't belong because your presence threatens them. Because if you can succeed, if you can win, if you can stand in the rooms they thought they owned and demand to be heard, then everything they believe about their superiority falls apart. They need you to fail. They need you to give up. They need you to accept the limits they've drawn around your life. Don't give them what they need.
Fight. Be afraid, but fight anyway. Let them underestimate you, and then prove them wrong. Channel your anger into something they can't ignore. Plant your seeds even if you'll never see the flowers, and know deep in your bones that you are enough, that you have always been enough, that their inability to see your value says everything about them and nothing about you. Judge Pemberton looked at me and saw a confused teenager. The Whitmans looked at my grandmother and saw a convenient scapegoat. The system looked at both of us and saw problems to be processed, not people to be respected. They were all wrong, and by the time they realized how wrong they were, it was too late. They had judged the wrong girl, they had underestimated the wrong woman, and they had awakened something in me that will never, ever go back to sleep. My name is Zara Mitchell. I am a black woman, I am an attorney,